What would you do if you came home after a long day, only to find a stranger's SUV parked in your garage like they owned the place? Not the driveway. Not the curb. Inside your garage. That was the absurd situation I walked into, and believe me, it only got worse from there. I pulled into my driveway, expecting the usual peace of my quiet neighborhood, but instead, I was greeted with a sight so ridiculous that for a second, I thought I had driven to the wrong house. My garage door was wide open, and sitting inside, as if it belonged there, was a massive SUV. A fresh iced coffee sat on the hood, condensation still dripping down the sides. Whoever had parked here had done so recently. But the most unsettling part? The vehicle was parked perfectly, like the driver had taken their time lining it up just right, as if this was their personal space. It wasn't my sister's car. It wasn't my neighbor's. And it sure as hell wasn't mine. At first, I thought maybe it was some delivery guy who had used my driveway to turn around and left his car for a second. Maybe an Uber driver got confused. But when I stepped out of my car and got a closer look, my gut told me something else was going on. The doors were locked. The coffee on the hood suggested the driver wasn't far, but no one was in sight. I checked my front door, no signs of forced entry, nothing unusual. Before I could even start knocking on doors to find out who thought they had the right to park in my garage, she appeared. Short bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of smug expression that screamed, "I dare you to challenge me." She stepped out of the house next door, sipping her drink like this was just another Tuesday. I turned to her, my patience already running thin. "Excuse me. Do you know whose car that is?" Without hesitation, she nodded. "Yeah. It's mine." Silence. I blinked. She sipped her drink. "I'm sorry, what?" She tilted her head, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "I parked there." A laugh of disbelief escaped me. "You parked in my garage?" She rolled her eyes, as if I was making a big deal over nothing. "It was empty." "What's the big deal?" I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. Surely, this was a joke. Any second now, she was going to laugh and move her car. But no. She just kept looking at me, totally unfazed, like this was normal behavior. The audacity nearly knocked me off my feet. "You can't just park in my garage because you feel like it." She scoffed. "Well, I was in a hurry, and your driveway is too sloped for my SUV. You have so much space, and since you weren't home, what's the harm?" Oh, this was going to be a problem. I took a deep breath, rubbing my temples. "The harm is that it's illegal. You're trespassing. Move your car." She crossed her arms. "I will. But I have errands to run, so I'll get to it later." I laughed again, this time out of pure disbelief. "No. You'll move it now." Karen let out the most exaggerated sigh I had ever heard, as if I was some unreasonable landlord demanding rent on time. "I can't. I'm going out with my friends. Just be a good neighbor and let it be." And with that, she turned and walked back into her house, shutting the door in my face. I stood there, jaw clenched, trying to process what had just happened. I could have called the cops. I could have had her towed. But something about that smug little smirk when she dismissed me lit a much pettier fire inside me. Fine. She wanted to park in my garage so badly. She could stay in my garage. I took one last look at the SUV sitting smugly in my garage, then at the closed door of Karen's house, where she had just disappeared without a second thought. She really thought she had won. That she could dismiss me like some background character in her world. But if there was one thing I couldn't stand, it was people who acted like the rules didn't apply to them. And I wasn't about to let her walk all over me in my own home. So, instead of arguing, instead of wasting my breath on someone who clearly didn't care, I walked back inside my house, grabbed the garage remote, and locked the door. Manually. From the inside. Then I went to the side door leading into the garage and slid the deadbolt into place. There. No way in. No way out. Karen wanted my garage. Now, she could have it. I double-checked every lock, packed my bags, and, without a second thought, left for a week-long vacation. Sunday drinks. No HOA. No entitled neighbors thinking they could take advantage of me. And best of all, no Karen. What I didn't know was that, in the middle of her little power trip, Karen had made one crucial mistake. Somewhere between me telling her to move the car and her slamming the door in my face, she had actually stepped into the garage. Maybe to grab something from her SUV. Maybe just to gloat for a second longer. But she had done it after I had already gone inside my house, before I locked the doors. And now? Now she was locked inside. At first, she probably didn't even realize it. Maybe she took her time, sipping the last of her overpriced iced coffee while scrolling through her phone. But when she finally went to leave and reached for the garage door handle, it didn't budge. Then she tried the side door. Deadbolt. Her heart must have skipped a beat. She pressed the button inside her car, expecting the garage to open, but nothing happened. Because I had cut off the power to the system before I left. Reality sank in. She was stuck. By the time I was halfway to my vacation destination, drink in hand, enjoying the fresh air, Karen was pacing the garage, phone in hand, trying to get a signal. But garages were nothing more than concrete boxes. No bars. No Wi-Fi. Just the slow, creeping realization that she was trapped in a place she had arrogantly claimed as her own. At first, she did what any self-righteous person would do. She banged on the walls. She shouted for help. But the neighbors were either too far away or simply didn't care. She honked the horn of her SUV a few times, but the sound barely carried beyond the closed space. By the second day, she must have been seething. Because that was when she got creative. She started digging through her purse, searching for anything useful. A phone charger? No outlets. A spare key? Pointless. Instead, all she found were some breath mints, a half-crushed granola bar, and an overpriced bottle of alkaline water. Next, she raided her car, rummaging through the glove compartment like a raccoon in a dumpster. Jackpot. A pack of stale crackers, a melted chocolate bar, and an old energy drink. It wasn't exactly gourmet, but it would have to do. The bathroom situation? That was a different nightmare altogether. After holding it for as long as humanly possible, she gave in. There was an empty Starbucks cup in the back seat. She used it. She would never speak of it again. By the third day, desperation had fully set in. She was banging on the walls at all hours, screaming for someone to hear her. The SUV's horn was blown so many times that the battery started to die. But then came her most humiliating attempt at escape. The garage had one tiny window near the ceiling. Too small for her to climb through, but maybe, just maybe, someone would see her. Using what little energy she had left, she climbed onto the hood of her SUV, then the roof, just to reach the window. She waved frantically, screamed at the top of her lungs. And finally, someone appeared. A teenager on a skateboard. This was it. This was her chance. Hey! Help! I'm stuck. The kid stopped, looking up at her, clearly confused. What? Karen, in full panic mode, tried to explain. But instead of telling the truth, she went full Karen mode. He kidnapped me, she shrieked. My neighbor locked me in here. Call the police. The kid blinked. Wait, you're saying you were kidnapped? In a garage? That has a car? He scratched his head, clearly trying to make sense of it. why don't you just drive out?" Karen growled in frustration. "It's locked, you idiot. Just do what I say." The second that insult left her lips, she saw it, the shift in the kid's face. His hesitation. And then? He smirked. Shrugged. "Yeah, no," he said, pushing off on his skateboard. "Sounds like you belong in there." And just like that, her last hope disappeared down the street. By day 4, she had officially started losing it. She had full conversations with the iced coffee cup from earlier, which she had now named Wilson. She tried one last desperate escape attempt, the doggy door. It was tiny. A flap barely big enough for a golden retriever. But she was determined. She got on her stomach. Wiggled forward. Her head made it through. Her shoulders? Not so much. She was now stuck halfway in and halfway out, flailing like a cartoon character. It took her 20 minutes of screaming and pure humiliation before she finally managed to pull herself back inside. And by then, she knew. She wasn't getting out of this on her own. She needed Ethan. That realization made her sick. But when she finally found her phone in her car's cup holder and turned it on, praying it had even a single bar of signal, she had just enough battery left to send one desperate text. "Help me, you monster." And miles away, lounging in a beach chair, Ethan read the message, smirked, and ordered another drink. Karen could wait. By the time Karen had resorted to screaming at her iced coffee cup for companionship, the world outside had completely moved on without her. The irony was almost poetic. For once, no one was paying attention to her. No one was coming to check on her, no one was wondering where she had disappeared to. And that was the worst punishment of all. At first, she had convinced herself that someone, anyone, would notice her absence. Her husband, Todd, surely would. Maybe he wasn't the most observant man, but even he had to realize his wife hadn't come home for days. Lisa, her best friend, would start asking questions. The HOA? Oh, they'd absolutely step in, she had so many connections there. She was too important to be forgotten. But that's exactly what happened. While Karen was trapped inside my garage, losing her mind, Todd was enjoying the best week of his life. He had assumed she was out shopping, on a spa trip, or visiting her sister. And honestly, he didn't care enough to check. His evenings were peaceful for the first time in years. No nagging, no micromanaging, no HOA drama. He ate takeout on the couch, watched whatever he wanted, and slept like a baby without being woken up at 6 a.m. by Karen yelling about some new HOA complaint. It wasn't until Lisa started texting and calling, asking where Karen was, that Todd even considered something might be off. "Have you heard from Karen?" Lisa's text read. "She hasn't answered my calls since Monday. Super weird." Todd, half distracted, simply texted back, "Probably shopping. You know how she is." Lisa wasn't buying it. She called him. "She always texts back," Lisa insisted. "Even if she's busy. This isn't like her." Todd sighed. He didn't want to deal with this. But the seed was planted. Maybe Karen wasn't just ignoring people. Maybe something actually was wrong. So, begrudgingly, he decided to check. It was a half-hearted effort, at best. He strolled over to my property, not even bothering to knock on my door, just peeking around the garage from a distance. It was locked. No obvious signs of distress. No reason to care. If Karen was in trouble, she'd have found a way to make it everyone's problem. He shrugged and walked back home. He was too relaxed to deal with her nonsense. Meanwhile, I was still on vacation, completely unaware, or maybe just fully aware, of Karen's slow descent into madness. What I was aware of, however, was the new HOA email sitting in my inbox. Apparently, I had been reported again. This time, I was being fined for an abandoned vehicle on my property. I actually laughed when I saw the email. The HOA, in all their wisdom, had decided that Karen's SUV, the one she had parked in my garage without permission, was now a community violation. I was expected to remove it within 48 hours or face further penalties. They had no idea that Karen herself was inside. I smirked and forwarded the email right back. Feel free to tow it. It's not mine. Of course, the HOA did nothing. Because why would they? Rules weren't about fairness, they were about control. They only enforced them when it benefited the right people. And Karen? She had always been one of the right people. Until now. Back in the garage, Karen was finally starting to break. The once smug, untouchable woman who had strutted onto my property like she owned it was now reduced to a desperate mess. She had tried everything. Screaming, banging on the walls, honking the car horn until the battery completely died. And now, she was left with nothing. Her last attempt at escape, the doggy door, had ended in complete humiliation. She could still feel the ache in her shoulders from where she had gotten stuck halfway in and halfway out, flailing like a fool. There was no way out. No one coming to save her. She was alone. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't in control. She wasn't the one giving orders, making complaints, or demanding special treatment. She was just stuck. And no one cared. By the 5th day, she was fully unraveling. She had stopped trying to scream. Her voice was gone. She had stopped pacing. Her body was exhausted. Instead, she just sat there, slumped against her car, staring blankly at the iced coffee cup she had once arrogantly left on the hood. The same one she had now named Wilson. "I bet you think this is funny," she muttered, glaring at the cup. Wilson, of course, had no response. "Shut up," she snapped. But Wilson just stared back, smug as ever. She let out a shuddering breath, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had to survive. Her food supply was nearly gone. The stale crackers were finished, the melted chocolate bar had been scraped clean, and the only thing left was the last half of the alkaline water. She took a slow sip, forcing herself to ration it. She couldn't afford to waste it. And then, as if the universe decided to mock her one last time, her phone vibrated. Karen lunged for it. The screen was dark. Battery almost dead. 1 bar left. With shaking hands, she opened her messages, her pride disappearing with every tap of the keyboard. "Help me, you monster." She hit send. Prayed. A moment later, another message popped up. "You locked me in, psychopath. Let me out." And miles away, relaxed and completely unbothered, I stared at the screen, then chuckled. Karen had told me to be a good neighbor and let it be. So really, I was just following her advice. I put my phone away. Ordered another drink. Karen could wait. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I knew something was up. The air felt charged, like the aftermath of a storm, thick with tension. But instead of dark clouds, I was greeted with something far more satisfying, the sight of my garage door shaking violently from the inside, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone screaming. I took my time. Pulled into my usual spot. Adjusted my mirrors. Picked up my drink from the cup holder. Sipped it slowly. Then, with a smirk tugging at my lips, I pressed the garage remote. The door rattled, clicked, then finally began to rise, inch by inch, flooding the dim space with sunlight. And that was when Karen exploded out. Wild-eyed, disheveled, reeking of stale energy drinks and desperation, she stumbled into the fresh air like a feral animal finally freed from its cage. Her once carefully maintained bob was a frizzy disaster, her designer leggings were filthy from days spent on the cold garage floor, and the moment her gaze landed on me, it was pure, unfiltered rage. "You," she shrieked, voice raw from screaming. "You absolute psychopath. You locked me in there for a week. Do you have any idea what I've been through? I could have died." I raised an eyebrow, taking another leisurely sip of my drink. "I mean, I assumed you'd move your car when I told you to," I said casually. "Guess that didn't happen." Karen's face twitched. Her fists clenched. She was vibrating with fury. "I am calling the police," she screeched, jabbing a trembling finger at me. ***, this is unlawful imprisonment. Kidnapping. You're going to jail." I sighed, pulling out my phone. "Want me to call them for you? Or do you want to use my phone since, you know?" I nodded toward her dead, useless phone clutched in her filthy hands. "Yours is probably out of battery." For the first time, she hesitated. Something wasn't right. She had expected panic, desperation, excuses. Instead, she was met with calm. That's when I pulled the final card. Reaching into my car, I popped open the glove compartment and pulled out a small, compact security camera. Karen froze. "You see," I said, tapping the screen, "I've had cameras installed around my property for a while now. And wouldn't you know it? They've been recording this whole time." Her face paled. I turned the screen toward her, pressing play. There she was, in full HD clarity, marching up my driveway, smugly dismissing me when I told her to move her car. There she was, arrogantly turning her back on me, waving me off like I was beneath her. And then, the cherry on top, there she was, sneaking into my garage before I locked it and left. I let the footage play for a few seconds longer, just enough to let realization sink in. "So, technically," I said, locking eyes with her, "you locked yourself in. I just didn't know you were inside when I left." Karen's mouth opened. Closed. She was searching for an argument, for anything she could say to turn this around. But there was nothing. She had no leverage. No story. No defense. "Of course," I added, slipping my phone back into my pocket, "if you'd still like to call the cops, be my guest. I'd love to show them this." Karen's breath hitched. She clenched her jaw so hard I thought her teeth might crack. And then, because the universe clearly had a sense of humor, her husband, Todd, finally decided to show up. He pulled into the driveway, stepped out of his car, and looked between us with a confused expression. "Hey, babe," he said casually. "Where have you been? Lisa's been freaking out. She said she hasn't heard from you in days." Karen whipped around. "Todd," she gasped, suddenly shifting into victim mode. "This lunatic locked me in his garage for a week. He left me there like some kind of animal." Todd blinked. Looked at me. Looked at the camera still clutched in my hand. Then looked back at Karen. "Wait, so you were in his garage?" His brows furrowed. "Why? I parked there for a bit, and then he locked it." Karen stammered. Todd scratched the back of his head. "So why did you park in his garage?" "That's not the point," she snapped. I folded my arms, leaning against my car. "Your wife trespassed on my property, refused to move her car, and then got herself stuck inside. I've got it all on camera." Todd exhaled slowly. "Karen, did you actually do that?" Her face burned. She knew she had lost. But the humiliation wasn't over. Because at that exact moment, her phone buzzed in her hand. A notification. I could see her expression shift from anger to dread as she glanced down at the screen. The HOA. A fine. A hefty one. The message was clear: unauthorized use of another resident's property. Multiple complaints from neighbors. Violation of community rules. And the worst part? Effective immediately, Karen's privileges were revoked for an entire year. No pool access. No clubhouse reservations. No power over anyone. The HOA she had once used as a weapon had finally turned against her. I grinned, giving her a little mocking salute. "See you around, Karen." She seethed. There was nothing left to do. Todd let out a long sigh, already tired of whatever argument was coming next. "So, should I even ask?" he muttered. "Drive." Karen snapped, crossing her arms. And with that, Todd put the car in reverse and pulled out of the driveway, taking the most defeated woman on earth with him. I watched them go, taking one last slow sip of my drink. Then I turned back to my garage. Shook my head in amusement. I had won. And the best part? Karen had done it to herself. As Todd's car disappeared down the street, I let out a slow breath, feeling the last of the tension finally leave my body. It was over. Karen had stormed off, humiliated beyond belief, and for the first time since she had decided to make my life difficult, she had nothing left to say. No more threats. No more HOA-backed nonsense. Just pure, unfiltered defeat. And honestly, it was beautiful. I turned back to my house, stepping into my garage, the one that, for the past week, had been Karen's personal prison. The stale scent of energy drinks and desperation still lingered in the air. A half-crushed protein bar wrapper sat abandoned near the SUV's tire, and on the hood, the infamous iced coffee cup, the one that had started it all, still sat there, its contents long melted. It almost felt poetic. With a smirk, I grabbed the cup and tossed it into the trash where it belonged. Then, for good measure, I reset the garage's security system, making sure this would never happen again. But the real victory? That came later, when I got one final email from the HOA. I half expected another ridiculous fine, another bureaucratic attempt to keep Karen happy at my expense. But no. This time, it was different. Karen had finally pushed them too far. Her privileges were revoked for an entire year. No pool access. No clubhouse reservations. No ability to file complaints. For the first time ever, Karen had no power. And without her ability to harass people through HOA rules, she was just another angry neighbor with no one left to boss around. That thought made me smile as I settled onto my porch, watching the evening sun dip below the rooftops. Karen had spent years making life miserable for everyone around her, convinced that she was untouchable, that the rules only applied when they benefited her. But in the end, it wasn't the HOA, or the police, or even me who had truly taken her down. She did it to herself. Now, the only question left was, how long before she tried to claw her way back to power? And more importantly, who would be her next victim? Have you ever had to deal with a Karen who thought they ruled the neighborhood? Or worse, an HOA that seemed to exist just to make your life miserable? Share your stories below, let's see who had it worse.